A white nurse was dragged out of the emergency room by security, while a senior physician screamed that she'd interfered with a VIP patient's treatment. Her ID badge hit the floor. The whole ward watched. Some of them laughed. 40 seconds later, 3 armored military vehicles rolled through the hospital's front gates, and a dozen elite soldiers moved through the lobby in full tactical gear, demanding one name, not the chief surgeon, not the hospital director, Nurse Claire Hart. Because what nobody inside Redwood Memorial Hospital knew, what Claire had never told a single person, was that she had once kept soldiers alive in places that don't appear on any public map, and the man dying upstairs needed exactly that. If this story has you gripped already, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning started the way most of Claire Hart's mornings at Redwood Memorial started, with someone talking over her. She was standing at the nurse's station on the 4th floor, reviewing an intake chart for a 63-year-old male admitted overnight with chest pressure and irregular rhythm. She had flagged 3 anomalies in his medication history: a beta blocker prescribed by his cardiologist that conflicted with the diuretic listed in his pharmacy records, and a potassium reading that hadn't been rechecked since admission 6 hours ago. She was in the middle of writing up a formal note when Dr. Garrison Holt walked past, plucked the chart from her hands without looking at her, and handed it to the charge nurse on his left. "Pull a repeat BMP and get cardiology on the phone," he said, as if the idea had just occurred to him. The charge nurse wrote it down. Nobody mentioned Claire. She stood there for a moment with her hands at her sides. "I already flagged those in the notes," she said, keeping her voice even. Holt glanced back. He was 47, tall, thinning hair combed sideways in a way that suggested he'd once been told it looked distinguished and had never updated that opinion. He had a particular kind of expression for nurses who spoke without being addressed, something just short of contempt, padded with just enough professionalism to deny it. "Thank you, Claire," he said, the way you'd thank someone for holding a door. She picked up her pen and went back to the station. That was 7:14 in the morning. Altet. Redwood Memorial Hospital occupied the northeast quarter of Ashford City's medical district, a mid-sized regional facility that handled everything from routine post-op to the occasional trauma transfer that the county's smaller clinics couldn't manage. It had 450 beds, 2 surgical suites, a level 3 ICU, and an administration building attached to the main tower that housed people whose primary job, as far as most floor nurses could tell, was finding new ways to make the floor harder to work on. Claire had been here for 3 years. Before that, she'd done a stint at a VA facility in Raleigh and 2 years at a community hospital in rural Western Virginia, where she'd once performed a needle decompression on a gunshot patient in an elevator because the trauma bay was full and waiting wasn't an option. She didn't talk about that. She didn't talk about most of what she'd done before nursing school either, the years before her discharge, before the civilian credentials, before she'd quietly filed the military paperwork, boxed up the uniforms, and decided that the best version of her skills was one that didn't require anyone to know where those skills came from. She was 31. She looked younger than that on most days, which people sometimes mentioned as though it were a compliment. She wore her dark hair pulled back tight when she was working, kept her movements economical, and had a habit of going still in a way that made some people uncomfortable. The kind of stillness that comes from spending years in environments where unnecessary motion got people hurt. None of that mattered at Redwood Memorial. What mattered at Redwood Memorial was that she was a floor nurse, not a physician, and the distance between those two categories was something the senior medical staff maintained the way other people maintained fences. By 11 o'clock, she had handled 7 patients, caught a potential drug interaction that the overnight attending had missed, and taken a 15-minute lunch break sitting on a utility stairwell because the break room on 4 had been taken over by a departmental meeting she hadn't been invited to. She was eating a granola bar and reading through a continuing education module on her phone when the door opened and Marcus Webb came in. Marcus was a third-year nursing student doing his clinical rotation on her floor, 22, earnest, slightly overwhelmed by everything, the kind of person who still got a look on his face when a patient squeezed his hand. He dropped onto the step beside her. "You're not at the meeting?" "No," she said. "Dr. Holt's presenting on the ICU restructure." He hesitated. I think they're talking about the charge nurse position. Claire finished the granola bar and folded up the wrapper. I know. Are you... I mean, did you apply? Yes. He looked at her for a moment. And? She picked up her phone. They gave it to Renner. Renner was a nurse who'd been at Redwood for 7 years. He was competent, which was real, and he'd gone to the same medical school as 3 of the department heads, which was the part that actually mattered. She didn't say that second part out loud. She thought it, noted it, and moved on, the way she moved on from most things. That's not right, Marcus said. A lot of things aren't right. She stood up and smoothed her scrubs. Come on. Mr. Dalloway in 412 needs his fluids checked, and he hates everyone except you. The morning turned into afternoon. An afternoon turned into the kind of late shift that happens when 2 nurses call in sick and nobody volunteers to cover, and the supervisor starts looking at schedules with an expression like she's about to say something nobody wants to hear. Claire picked up 2 extra patients without being asked. She also, at 3:47 p.m., noticed that a post-surgical patient in 408 was showing early signs of sepsis that hadn't been caught on the 2 p.m. round. Elevated heart rate, subtle drop in pressure, skin that didn't look right when you looked at it long enough, and she put a call into the attending on duty, a younger hospitalist named Dr. Farley, who actually listened when nurses called, which was why he was still relatively unpopular with the senior staff. He came up, examined the patient, ordered labs and a blood culture, and started antibiotics within 30 minutes. Good catch, he said, on his way back to the elevator. Early sepsis reads like anxiety if you're not paying attention, she said. Most people aren't. He got in the elevator. She went back to her charts. At 4:30, she got called into the nursing supervisor's office. Donna Pressler ran the 4th floor nursing staff the way some people run a small country, with absolute certainty that her authority extended slightly further than it actually did, and a willingness to enforce that belief through sheer confidence. She was 54, wore reading glasses she didn't need on top of her head, and had a habit of pausing before she spoke in a way that was supposed to suggest careful consideration, but mostly just felt like she was building up to something she'd already decided. Claire sat in the chair across from her desk. The chair was slightly lower than it should have been, which she suspected was deliberate. I've been getting some feedback, Donna said. Claire waited. From Dr. Holt's office, and from the family coordinator for the Meridian Group patient. She folded her hands. You went into 411 this morning. To check the IV line, it was running slow. That patient is a VIP case. His care is being managed directly by Dr. Holt's team. Any contact with that patient or his family has to be coordinated through. His IV was running at 40% of the ordered rate, Claire said. He'd been NPO since midnight and was showing signs of dehydration. I adjusted the rate and documented it. That's not the issue. Then what is? Donna's expression shifted slightly. The issue is that you entered that room without notifying the primary team, made an adjustment to the patient's ongoing care, and didn't follow protocol. The protocol for noticing that a patient's IV isn't running correctly? Claire. A pause. I'm trying to give you an opportunity to acknowledge that there's a concern here. She looked at the woman across the desk. She'd had this conversation before. Not here specifically, but the shape of it, the texture of it. The polite version of you did something right that made the wrong person uncomfortable. I documented everything, she said. It's all in the chart. That's noted. Donna picked up a sheet of paper. I've been asked to issue you a formal warning for failure to follow patient care coordination protocols. Claire looked at the paper. This will go into your personnel file, Donna said. Given that this is your second documented concern this quarter. The first one was for not attending a mandatory meeting that I wasn't notified about until 40 minutes before it started while I was mid-procedure. I'm required to inform you that any subsequent concern may result in suspension pending review. Claire took the paper, read it, signed it because refusing to sign it didn't actually accomplish anything, and she understood bureaucratic systems well enough to know when fighting the process was going to cost her more than it was worth. She folded her copy and put it in her pocket. Is there anything else? She said. No, Donna said. Thank you for your time. Claire walked out. She was back on the floor for 20 minutes before she heard the voices. She was at the nurse's station updating her documentation when Dr. Holt came out of the elevator with two other men she didn't recognize, not hospital staff, based on their clothes, suits rather than white coats. The kind of suits that suggested they worked somewhere that cared more about appearances than most hospitals did. One of them was on a phone. The other was talking to Holt with the practiced urgency of someone who moved through buildings expecting things to happen quickly. She went back to her notes. At 5:15 p.m., Dr. Holt stopped at the nurse's station and looked directly at her. "I need to know who was in contact with the Greer patient this morning," he said. "I checked his IV at approximately 08:30, she said. "It's in the documentation." Holt looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Donna Pressler, who had appeared from somewhere and was standing just behind his left shoulder the way subordinates appear when they've been waiting for exactly this conversation. "Pull her from the floor," Holt said. "Dr. Holt, until this is reviewed, I don't want unsupervised nursing contact with any of the VIP cases." He said it without raising his voice, which was somehow worse. "It's a liability issue." "I adjusted a malfunctioning IV line," Claire said, "and that decision is under review." He turned to the charge nurse. "Reassign her caseload." She stood very still at the nurse's station while someone else was handed her patients. She felt Marcus watching her from across the room. She didn't look at him. She found out what she was being accused of at 6:47 p.m. in a conference room on the third floor with Donna Pressler, a hospital administrator named Kellen Moore, and two people from legal whose names she didn't catch because they didn't offer them. The claim was that she had altered the IV flow rate on the Greer patient in a way that had introduced an adverse interaction with his ongoing medication protocol, that the adjustment she'd made, which she had documented fully and in real time, had caused a delay in a medication delivery that created a complication in his care. "That's not accurate," she said. "We're not here to argue accuracy," Moore said. He was 40-something, wore a very clean tie, and had the energy of someone who had been in rooms like this many times and found them energizing. "We're here to discuss the formal review process." The IV was running at less than half the ordered rate when I found it. That means his scheduled antibiotic had been infusing incorrectly for hours before I touched anything. That complication existed before I walked into the room. Your adjustment changed the flow rate back to what it was supposed to be. The documentation shows the timestamps. Miss Hart. Moore leaned forward slightly. The Greer family has retained counsel. Given the sensitivity of this case and the patient's status, the hospital has made a decision to place you on immediate administrative leave while the matter is, you're suspending me. We're placing you on administrative leave because I fixed an IV that was running wrong. Nobody answered that, not because they didn't have an answer, but because the answer was one they'd already decided not to give her. She left the building at 7:23 p.m. Security walked her out, not aggressively, not with hands on her, but they walked her out and they waited while she collected her things from her locker, and one of them held the door as she passed through the main lobby and out into the evening air. Her ID badge had been deactivated while she was still in the conference room. She'd felt it go dead in her pocket, some electronic signal she couldn't detect but somehow registered anyway. The parking lot was half empty at this hour. The evening was cool, dry, the kind of late fall air that smelled faintly of exhaust and cut grass from somewhere. She sat in her car and did not, for a long moment, do anything. She thought about the patient. She thought about whether anyone had gone back to check his fluid balance in the last 2 hours, or whether the assumption was that removing her from the floor had solved the problem. She thought about the way Holt had said, "Pull her from the floor without looking at her," as though she were a piece of furniture someone had arranged incorrectly. She thought about a lot of things. Then she started the car. She was 3 blocks from the hospital, waiting at a red light when her phone rang. Unknown number. Not a hospital extension. She knew all of those. She almost didn't answer, then picked up out of instinct she couldn't quite name. Hart. She hadn't said her name like that in 3 years. It just came out that way. A pause on the other end. Then, "Sergeant Hart, this is Major Delgado. I don't know if you remember me." She remembered him. She remembered a lot of things she kept very carefully filed in a place she didn't open much. "I remember," she said. "We have a situation," he said. I need to know your current location. The light turned green and she didn't move for a moment. What kind of situation? The kind that doesn't get explained on an open line, he said. There's a vehicle about 30 seconds behind you. We've been tracking your phone since the suspension went through. I'm sorry about the lead time. We should have called earlier. She checked her rearview mirror, a dark SUV, no plates visible in the dark. How long has that been there? She said. Since you left the building. She pulled forward through the intersection. Her hands were steady on the wheel, her breathing even, the particular kind of calm that doesn't come from the absence of stress, but from years of training that reprograms what your body does with it. What's the situation, Major? The patient you were removed from contact with today, he said. Victor Greer. He's not what the hospital thinks he is, and in the last 40 minutes, he's gone into cardiac collapse. She kept driving. Behind her, the SUV kept a steady distance. What do they need? She said. You, he said. That's it, just you. She exhaled once through her nose, through her. Tell them I'm on my way back, she said. She turned the car around. She saw the military vehicles from 2 blocks away, 3 of them, armored, moving through the hospital's access road with the kind of organized efficiency that cleared space without asking. She pulled into the lot and was met before she'd gotten her door fully open. 2 soldiers, full tactical gear, no insignia she could read in the dark. Sergeant Hart? One of them said. Yeah. With us, please. She didn't ask where. She walked with them through the ambulance bay, which was the fastest way into the building when the main lobby was a problem, and felt the shift in atmosphere the moment she passed through the double doors. The staff had the look of people who'd been told something without being told what it meant. Nurses standing still in hallways. An orderly just stopped mid-motion, holding a linen cart, watching. A pair of residents near the elevator, talking quietly and quickly, interrupting each other. Someone said her name as she passed. She couldn't tell who. She didn't stop. The elevator opened on the 4th floor and she stepped out into a situation she recognized immediately by the sound. Too quiet, too controlled, the mechanical efficiency of a space that's been locked down by people who know how to lock things down. 3 soldiers flanked the ICU entrance. A 4th was on a radio she couldn't hear from where she stood. And standing in the middle of the corridor just outside the ICU door was Garrison Holt. He looked at her the way people look when the world has rotated underneath them slightly. Not all the way disoriented, but enough that the usual footing wasn't quite where he expected it. What is she doing here, Gimmet? He said. She was called, one of the soldiers said. Called by who? By us. Major Delgado came around the corner from the stairwell, still in motion, still on a radio that he was lowering as he walked. He was 40, compact, the kind of person who took up exactly the amount of space he needed and no more. He looked at Claire for a moment with something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite gratitude, more like confirmation, like finding a piece of equipment where he'd left it. Sergeant Hart, thank you for coming back. Holt stepped forward. This patient is under my care. Was, Delgado said, not unkindly. His condition has been escalating for the last 90 minutes. I have 4 surgeons on the phone right now who can't get here in time and who've already told me that what we're looking at requires someone with field trauma experience in penetrating cardiac injury. He looked at Holt directly, the way you look at a problem you've already solved. Do you have that? Holt said nothing. Because she does, Delgado said. So I'd appreciate it if you didn't slow us down. He moved toward the ICU doors and Claire moved with him, and she heard the soldiers shift behind her, and she heard Holt say something that might have been an objection and might have been nothing, and then the doors closed and the corridor was behind her. Inside the ICU, Victor Greer was unconscious, connected to monitors that were showing exactly the kind of numbers you didn't want to see, surrounded by nurses and a respiratory tech and a second hospitalist who looked up at Claire with an expression she'd seen before. The particular look of someone who was competent in ordinary circumstances and had just come face to face with circumstances that weren't. Talk to me, she said, pulling on gloves. The hospitalist, a young woman, early 30s, name tag said Avery, started talking quickly, clipped, precise. She had it organized. Claire listened and moved at the same time, already reading the monitors, already adjusting. The waveform on the cardiac display told her something the verbal report hadn't yet reached. "I need a thoracic tray," she said, "and I need the room cleared down to essential personnel." "I'm sorry, who are you?" someone started. "She's the medic I told you was coming," Delgado said from behind her. "Do what she says." The room changed. People moved. Claire tied off her gloves and looked at the man on the bed, at the monitors, at the oxygen sat that was moving in the wrong direction, at the waveform that told a very specific story about a very specific kind of problem. And she thought about a night 4 years ago in a place that didn't exist officially, where she'd had a flashlight and a kit and someone's life in her hands, and 15 minutes before it stopped mattering. She'd had less than that even. The tray arrived. She picked up the first instrument. "Okay," she said, more to herself than anyone else. "Let's go." The monitors beeped. Someone in the hallway outside was shouting. She could hear it faintly through the doors, the particular pitch of an administrator who has just encountered something they don't have a form for. The soldiers outside the ICU doors didn't move. Claire didn't look up. Her hands were already working. And the room had gone quiet in the way rooms go quiet when everyone present has simultaneously realized that the most important thing happening in the building is happening right here. The thoracic tray was laid out to her left. Avery stood across from her, hands prepped, saying nothing because Claire hadn't asked her to say anything yet, and she was smart enough to read that. The respiratory tech adjusted the ventilator settings without being told, which meant he'd worked trauma before, which meant Claire didn't have to explain herself to him, which was one less thing. The cardiac monitor showed a waveform that was deteriorating in a specific pattern, not arrhythmia, not a standard MY presentation, something with more mechanical weight to it. She'd seen this pattern twice before. Once in a simulation at Fort Bragg, and once in a tent in the dark with a generator humming outside, and a man who made it home because she hadn't hesitated. "Pericardial effusion with tamponade," she said, "building fast. Whatever happened to him today accelerated it." "The echo from this morning didn't," Avery started. "The echo from this morning was 6 hours ago. This has been accumulating." She looked at the SAT reading, at the pressure numbers. "I need to drain it now, not in 5 minutes. Now." Avery didn't argue. She handed Claire the needle. The procedure was a pericardiocentesis, a guided needle into the pericardial sac to relieve the pressure that was slowly strangling the heart. It was not a complicated procedure in the abstract. In practice, on a deteriorating patient with a pressure that had already dropped twice in the last 20 minutes, with no imaging guidance because there wasn't time to set it up, it required a kind of fine-grained spatial certainty that came from doing things like this more times than you wanted to count. Claire placed her left hand flat on Greer's sternum, feeling the anatomy beneath the skin, and she made the angle calculation the way she'd made it in the field. Not from a textbook, from memory and muscle and the particular kind of attention that filters out everything that isn't immediately useful. She inserted the needle. The room held its breath. Dark fluid pulled back into the syringe. Not blood, not air, but the straw-colored fluid of a pericardial effusion, which meant she was in the right place, which meant she could drain it, which meant the heart could start working the way it was supposed to work. She worked the syringe and watched the monitor and said, "Tell me numbers." And Avery gave them to her in a steady, unbroken rhythm. Pressure, SAT, rate, the sequential data of a body deciding whether it was going to turn back from the edge it had been walking toward for the last hour. The pressure started to climb. Not fast, not dramatically, just steadily, incrementally, the way things recover when the obstruction is removed and the body remembers what it's supposed to be doing. "There," Avery said quietly, watching the monitor. "Not yet," Claire said. "Keep watching." She drained another 12 milliliters. The rate stabilized. The SAT came up 2 points, then 3, then held. It wasn't fixed. It wasn't over. But the man on the table was no longer actively dying, which was a different situation than the one they'd started with 4 minutes ago. She withdrew the needle and held pressure and looked at the monitor for a long moment, reading it the way she'd been trained to read it, looking for the secondary pattern that sometimes followed the primary one, the aftershock that caught people off guard when they thought the worst had passed. Nothing came. "Okay," she said. "Get cardiothoracic on the phone. He needs a surgical consult, and we need imaging to see how much residual fluid is in there. This is temporary stabilization. She stepped back from the bed slightly. Don't let anyone tell you it's a fix. Avery was already on the phone, turning away, relaying the situation with the kind of precision that told Claire she'd had good training somewhere and hadn't forgotten it. The respiratory tech was adjusting and documenting. The two other nurses in the room had that particular stillness that comes after a very bad moment that didn't go as badly as it could have. Delgado was standing near the door. She hadn't looked at him in 10 minutes. She looked at him now. He's stable, she said. For now. He nodded once. Good. I need to know what happened to him, she said, pulling off her outer gloves. Not the hospital version, the real version. He glanced toward the window in the ICU door. She caught it, a fraction of a second, an involuntary check. Not in here, then somewhere. But they went to a consultation room 2 doors down, a small space with a round table and chairs that didn't quite match, and a whiteboard on one wall with someone's half-erased differential on it. Delgado closed the door, and one of his soldiers took up a position outside without being told. Victor Greer is a federal official, Delgado said, attached to a DOD oversight committee. He was admitted to this hospital 3 days ago under a cover history, a gallbladder issue, elective. The real reason was a prior cardiac event he'd had overseas that his own physicians were still trying to characterize. So the VIP protocol wasn't about his status, Claire said. It was about keeping his actual medical history out of the general record. Correct, which meant the physicians treating him here were working with an incomplete picture. He paused. Deliberately incomplete, from his side, for security reasons. He didn't want the full history disclosed to a civilian hospital. That's a decision that could kill someone, she said. It nearly did. He didn't say it defensively. He said it like someone who understood the cost of the calculus and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. We've been monitoring his condition remotely. When his status started deteriorating this afternoon, we started tracking it and realized the hospital's response was insufficient. They thought he had an anxiety reaction, she said. I read the notes before I was pulled from the floor. Yes. Someone flagged that his IV was running wrong this morning. The fluid deficit alone would have stressed his cardiac function. Someone flagged it, Delgado said, and got suspended for it. She looked at him. We know what happened today, he said, not unkindly. We've been watching the facility since he was admitted. Your interaction with his care was the only correct clinical response he received in the last 24 hours. A beat. The suspension was retaliatory. Holt didn't want a floor nurse's documentation on record suggesting his team had missed something. The room was quiet for a moment. You knew I was suspended before you called me, she said. We knew within 20 minutes of it happening. So you were going to call anyway. We were already deciding how to approach you, he said. His collapse accelerated the timeline. He put his hands flat on the table. I need you to understand. We're not here just because of today. Greer's condition requires someone who understands field trauma in a context that civilian physicians here aren't prepared for. His prior event involved a penetrating cardiac injury that was partially repaired in a forward operating environment. It left scar tissue in a location that complicates standard intervention. She absorbed that, reorganized her understanding of the pericardiocentesis she'd just performed, the reason it had worked, the reason standard treatment hadn't. That's why the echo this morning was inconclusive, she said, more to herself than him. The scarring obscured the fluid accumulation. Their cardiology consult missed it. Because they didn't know what they were looking at. She exhaled. Who knows about his real history? Within this hospital? Now? You and me. The door opened without a knock, and Kellen Moore from hospital administration came in with the energy of someone who had decided to be angry before he'd established whether anger was warranted. He stopped when he saw Delgado. He processed the uniform, the posture, the soldier outside the door, and recalibrated slightly without losing the edge. I need to understand what authority, he started. Federal, Delgado said. That's not... I can get you the specific statutory language if that's useful, but I'm going to need you to take a few steps back and let my team do its work." Delgado said it in the tone of someone who'd had versions of this conversation before and had learned to shorten them. "Your facility has a patient in critical condition. My team is managing that situation. Any concerns about process can be addressed after the patient is stable." Moore's eyes moved to Claire. "She was suspended. She was recalled," Delgado said, "by us, which supersedes. You can't just walk into a civilian hospital and, Mr. Moore," Delgado looked at him with patience that wasn't warm. "Your hospital missed a life-threatening diagnosis, twice. Your senior physician had a nurse suspended for correctly identifying a problem his team missed, and your patient is alive right now because she came back." He let that sit for exactly 1 second. "So I'd encourage you to think carefully about which part of tonight you want to make a problem." Moore opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Claire again, then back at Delgado, and left. Claire watched him go. "He's going to make calls," she said. "He already is," Delgado said. "Let him." She went back to the ICU at 9:40 p.m. because she needed to see Greer's numbers herself, and not through a relay. Avery was still there, charting, and she looked up when Claire came in with a mix of expressions that hadn't quite resolved into one thing, something between uncertainty and a kind of careful reassessment. "Cardiothoracic is on their way in," Avery said. "ETA 40 minutes. "Good." Claire looked at the monitor. Numbers were holding. Not ideal, but stable. "Has his pressure done anything in the last 30 minutes? One dip at 9:15 came back on its own. I documented it." "Okay." She checked the fluid balance, read through the notes Avery had entered since the procedure. They were detailed and accurate. "You did good work tonight." Avery looked at her chart. I was just... You gave me clean numbers and sequence without me having to ask twice. In that situation, that matters." She looked up. "You've worked trauma before." 2 years at Riverside General, trauma 2. Claire nodded. That explained the instincts. "Can I ask you something?" Avery said. "Go ahead." "What was that procedure? The needle? I've seen pericardiocentesis, but the angle you used..." "Field modification," Claire said. "When you don't have guidance imaging, you adjust the approach based on anatomy and presentation. It's not standard." She paused. "It works in certain presentations. This was one of them." "Where did you learn?" Avery stopped, seemed to realize she was at the edge of something. "Sorry, that's probably..." "It's fine," Claire said, and didn't answer the question, and moved on, and Avery, who was smart, didn't push. At 10:20, something changed. She heard it before she understood it. A shift in the sound pattern of the corridor outside. Voices in a configuration that didn't match the usual ICU night noise. She stepped out and saw 2 of Delgado's soldiers moving toward the stairwell with a purpose that hadn't been there 20 minutes ago. She found Delgado near the nurse's station on his radio. "What happened?" she said. He lowered the radio. His expression had changed in a specific way, the kind of shift that meant the situation had developed in a direction he'd been monitoring for but hadn't confirmed until now. "My team has been running parallel to this," he said. "Background on the facility, on the people managing Greer's case. Standard protocol when we place someone in a civilian setting." He glanced toward the corridor window. "We found something." "What kind of something?" "The kind that explains why your documentation was a problem." He turned to face her fully. "The IV issue you flagged this morning, the rate discrepancy. We pulled the system logs. The rate was changed at 6:47 a.m. before your shift started. It was changed from the correct rate to the incorrect rate." She went still. "Someone said it wrong deliberately?" she said. "Someone changed it using a physician login. We're verifying whose." He paused. "But there's more. Greer's medical history in the hospital system, the cover history he came in with, it's been altered. Twice in the last 48 hours. Someone added notes to the record that weren't there on admission." "Added what kind of notes?" "Notes suggesting his condition was stable when it wasn't. Notes that would, if something had happened tonight, have provided documentation that the hospital had monitored him appropriately and there had been no warning signs. The shape of it formed in her mind. Not quickly. She wasn't someone who jumped to conclusions, she'd been trained not to, but steadily, piece by piece, the logic of it clicking together. Someone had set Greer's IV wrong. Someone had altered his record to erase the evidence of missed warning signs. And when a floor nurse had caught and corrected the IV issue, she'd been suspended before she could document anything further. They were covering their tracks, she said. It looks that way. His tone was careful. We don't have the full picture yet, but we have enough to secure the system and prevent any further alteration. Holt, she said. I'm not naming names until my team finishes the verification, he said, but I'm not telling you you're wrong either. Down the corridor, Moore had reappeared, this time with Dr. Holt beside him, and they were both moving toward the nurses' station with the coordinated energy of two people who had just agreed on a strategy. Holt stopped when he saw her. She looked at him steadily. He looked back, and she watched the calculation happen behind his eyes. The rapid, involuntary inventory of what he'd done and what she might know, and how much the soldiers in the corridor had changed the weight of those two things. I want to know what federal jurisdiction is being claimed here, he said, to Delgado rather than to her. I can have that documentation to you within the hour, Delgado said. In the meantime, your patient is alive because Nurse Hart came back when you'd suspended her, Delgado said. I'd think carefully before making that your next sentence, Doctor. Holt said nothing. Moore put a hand on his arm, a brief, cautioning touch, and Holt stepped back slightly, and the two of them withdrew without a clean exit, the way people withdraw when they realize the ground has shifted and they haven't yet figured out which way to move. Claire watched them go. Something about the way Holt had looked at her, not angry, not dismissive the way he'd been earlier, but something closer to cornered, told her that whatever Delgado's team was finding in those records was not going to stay quiet for much longer. She was right about that. At 11:03 p.m., one of Delgado's soldiers came back from the administrative wing carrying a tablet, and he handed it to Delgado without a word, and Delgado looked at it for a long moment. And when he looked up, his expression had settled into something hard and decided. We have the login records, he said quietly. She waited. The IV rate was changed using Dr. Holt's physician credentials, he said. At 6:47 a.m., he was logged into the system from his office terminal. The corridor was quiet. Someone at the far end of the floor was pushing a cart, the wheels making a soft, rhythmic sound against the linoleum, and somewhere an elevator dinged, and the monitors inside the ICU were doing their steady electronic work, and everything felt very ordinary and very wrong at the same time. That's not negligence, she said. No, Delgado said. That's intentional. Yes. She looked toward the ICU door. Greer was stable for now, and the cardiothoracic team was 40 minutes out, and Holt was somewhere in this building. And somewhere in this building was a record system that now had timestamps and login credentials and the particular kind of digital trail that didn't care what story you decided to tell. Delgado's radio crackled. He listened, and something moved through his face that she read before he said it. There's a problem, he said. What problem? The administrative system, he said. Someone just initiated a remote wipe on the records server. She turned. From inside this building, he said, in the last 4 minutes. And down the corridor, through the glass doors of the administrative suite, she could see the lights were on. Delgado was already moving. He didn't run. He moved with the kind of controlled speed that covered ground fast without announcing itself. And Claire was 2 steps behind him before she'd consciously decided to follow. The corridor lights were the standard overnight dim, harsh, where the fluorescents buzzed and shadowed where they didn't. And the administrative suite at the end of the hall had its lights on and its door slightly open. A thin rectangle of brightness that meant someone was inside who wasn't supposed to be. Martinez, Delgado said into the radio, voice low and flat. Lock the server room. Physical access now. And get someone on the network. I need that wipe stopped before it completes. A response crackled back. She couldn't make out the words. How long does a wipe take, she said. On a system that size? 40 minutes, maybe. If they started 4 minutes ago, we have time. He pushed through the administrative suite door without slowing. If they started earlier and we're only just seeing it, He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The suite was a large open room of desks and monitors and the particular organized clutter of people who spent their days in spreadsheets and policy documents. At this hour, it should have been empty. It wasn't. A man was at the far end, standing at a workstation with his back to them, and even from across the room, Claire recognized the set of his shoulders, the specific tension of someone doing something quickly that they'd planned to do quietly. More. He heard them and turned, and the expression on his face moved through several things very fast. Surprise, calculation, something that might have been a version of defiance and might have been fear in a suit. "I'm authorized to access this system," he said, before either of them spoke. "Step away from the terminal," Delgado said. "I'm the hospital administrator. I have full access to—" "Step away from the terminal, Mr. Moore." Something in his tone finished the argument. Moore stepped back, hands coming up slightly. Not surrender, more a performance of innocence. And one of Delgado's soldiers came through the door behind them and moved to the workstation without touching it, reading the screen. "Wipe is running," the soldier said. 17% complete. Stop it. I need the admin credentials to interrupt. Then get them." Delgado looked at Moore. "Override password. Now." Moore said nothing. "Every second that system runs, you're adding charges," Delgado said. "Obstruction, destruction of federal evidence. You want to think about whether this is the hill." Moore's jaw tightened. He looked at the screen, then at Delgado, then at Claire, and Claire watched him do the calculation. The same calculation she'd seen people do in bad situations, the weighing of what they'd already done against what they could still control. He gave the password. The soldier entered it. The wipe stopped at 23%. "What's recoverable?" Delgado said. "Everything above this point. The wipe only got into the archived backup layers." The soldier looked up. "Primary records are intact." The room redistributed itself slightly. The specific tension of the last 4 minutes, the kind that sits behind your sternum and makes everything feel slightly accelerated, shifted into something different. Not relief exactly, more like the moment after a near miss when the body hasn't yet decided how to process it. Claire looked at Moore. "Why?" she said. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. He looked at her with something that might have been contempt and might have been something closer to shame, and it was hard to tell which because they wore the same expression on some people. "I want a lawyer," he said. "That's your right," Delgado said. "Sit down." Holt was found 20 minutes later in his office on the second floor, in the process of doing something with his personal laptop that his attorney would later describe as organizing personal files, and that the forensic team would later describe as something considerably less benign. He didn't run, which Claire found faintly surprising. He sat in his office chair with the laptop still open and watched Delgado's team come through the door with the expression of someone who had spent the last 2 hours building a story and had just realized the audience wasn't buying it. Claire wasn't in the room for that part. She was in the ICU because Greer's numbers had ticked down slightly, and she wanted to be there when the cardiothoracic team arrived, and because standing in a room watching Holt get read his rights would have felt like something she was entitled to, and she'd learned that entitlement was mostly a distraction. The cardiothoracic team arrived at 11:47 p.m. 2 surgeons and a fellow out of Meridian General across the city, the kind of fatigue on their faces that means they'd already had a full day before this call came in. The lead surgeon, a man named Dr. Vance, who was in his mid-50s and had the permanently unimpressed expression of someone who'd been doing this long enough to have opinions about everything, looked at Greer's chart for about 45 seconds and then looked at Claire. "Who did the pericardiocentesis?" "I did," she said. He looked at the imaging that had been done in the interim, a portable echo the ICU team had managed to run after the stabilization, giving them their first real picture of what was in there. He looked at it for a moment with the focused silence of someone reading a map. "Field approach," he said. It wasn't a question. No guidance equipment available at the time. "You got good placement." He said it the way surgeons say things that are compliments without being framed as compliments. "There's still fluid, but it's not acute. We can manage it in the morning with a planned drainage under imaging." He set the chart down. "He's going to need a follow-up surgical consult on the old scar tissue, but not tonight." I know, she said. I flagged it in my notes. He looked at her for a moment with a slightly different expression. The recalibration one, the one she'd been getting a lot of tonight. Where did you train? He said. Nursing school at University of Virginia, she said. And before that, somewhere I can't really talk about. He looked at her for another second, then went back to the chart. Fair enough, he said, which was more than most people said when she gave that answer. It was past midnight when Delgado found her in the family waiting area at the end of the ICU corridor. Not because she'd been waiting for anything, but because she'd needed to sit down, and it was quiet, and nobody was looking for her there yet. She had a cup of vending machine coffee that tasted the way all vending machine coffee tasted, which was bad but warm, and she was holding it with both hands and not drinking it. He sat down across from her. Greer's going to make it, she said. Not a question. Looks that way. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, and for a moment he looked less like a military officer and more like someone who had been awake for a very long time. The records we recovered, even the 23% the wipe took. There's enough in what's left to establish the timeline. The IV change. And more. He paused. The record alterations go back further than 48 hours. The notes suggesting his condition was stable, so those were part of a longer pattern. Greer's been a patient here twice in the last 18 months, different cover history each time. Both times his records were accessed and modified by the same physician credentials. She absorbed that. Holt knew who he was. We think so. We're still building the picture, but yeah, we think Holt knew or found out and made a decision about what that information was worth. Worth to who? That's what federal investigators are going to spend the next several months determining. He looked at the middle distance. What I can tell you is that tonight, the evidence that exists, the login records, the timestamp data, the wipe attempt, all of it points directly at Holt and Moore. My team has copied and secured everything. It doesn't matter what else they try to delete. She drank some of the coffee. It was as bad as it looked. You should have called me sooner, she said. I know. He didn't make excuses for it. There were protocols around Greer's placement that limited how much external contact we could initiate. When his condition deteriorated, we had to move faster than the protocols preferred. He almost died because of those protocols. Yes, he said. That's a conversation I'm going to be having with several people for a while. A beat. For what it's worth, when I saw your suspension flag in the system, I pushed as hard as I could to accelerate. The suspension was the thing that made it urgent. Because it told you someone was trying to control the documentation. Because it told us someone knew what you'd found and wanted you gone before you found more. He looked at her. You caught the IV discrepancy at 8:30 in the morning. Holt suspended you by 5. That's a fast response. She thought about that, about the specific speed of it, the particular efficiency of someone who'd already been watching the floor, already monitoring what the nurses were documenting, already prepared to move if the wrong person noticed the wrong thing. He was watching the chart, she said, constantly. Auto alerts on any additions to the Greer record. Delgado sat back. The moment you entered your note about the IV adjustment, he got a notification. It settled into something that felt less like revelation and more like confirmation. The shape of what she'd suspected, filling in the way shapes fill in when the light changes. She'd walked into a room and fixed an IV line and documented it, the way she fixed things and documented things every day. The ordinary, unremarkable work of being careful and precise and paying attention, and it had been enough. Enough to threaten someone, enough to get her removed from the building. They thought getting rid of me solved it, she said. They didn't know who you were, Delgado said. At 1:15 a.m., the situation changed again, because in this building, on this night, things kept changing. One of the soldiers appeared in the waiting room doorway, a young woman, Specialist Reyes, who'd been the one to stop the records wipe, and who moved with a compactness that Claire had noticed earlier. Major, you need to see this. They followed her to the nursing station, where a second soldier had a tablet up and was showing Delgado something with the particular focused urgency of someone who understood what they were looking at. Claire looked at the tablet over Delgado's shoulder. Security footage, the hospital's own camera system, which Delgado's team had pulled access to in the first hour of the lockdown. The timestamp in the corner read 6:31 a.m. That morning, 14 and a half hours ago. The camera angle was the fourth-floor corridor, looking toward the ICU entrance. A figure in a white coat entered the frame, walked toward the ICU, stopped outside the door for a moment, then entered. The white coat had a name badge. At 6:31 a.m., the badge read Dr. G. Holt. He went in himself, Claire said. At 6:31, Delgado said. The IV change timestamp is 6:47. 16 minutes. 16 minutes inside the room before the rate changed in the system log. He didn't do it digitally, Claire said. He did it physically. Changed the rate manually on the pump, then logged the change through the system after the fact to make it look like an order modification. Which is why the login timestamp and the physical access timestamp don't quite line up, Reyes said from behind them. If you're looking at either record alone, it's explainable. When you put the camera footage against the system log, it falls apart, Delgado finished. The footage was clear. Not high resolution, not perfect, but clear enough. The name badge was legible when Reyes zoomed the frame. The timestamp was legible. The direction of movement was legible. Claire thought about Greer lying in that ICU bed all morning, his fluids running wrong, his body slowly accumulating a deficit that stressed a cardiac system that was already compromised by damage nobody at this hospital officially knew about. She thought about the morning rounds that had missed it. She thought about the note she'd written at 8:30 a.m. and the notification it had sent to Holt's phone and the suspension that had come 8 hours later. She thought about how close it had been. Is this enough? She said. Combined with the records, Delgado said. Yes, more than enough. For what? Criminal charges, deliberate endangerment of a federal official, falsification of medical records, obstruction. He handed the tablet back to Reyes. This isn't a licensing board situation anymore. At 2 a.m., the federal investigators arrived. Not military, civilian federal, two agents from an office that Delgado identified only as DOJ affiliated and didn't elaborate on. They were a man and a woman, both in their 40s, both with the specific neutral affect of people who had learned to have no readable expression in professional settings. The woman, Agent Ferris, took the evidence package from Delgado's team with the methodical care of someone who understood chain of custody the way other people understood breathing. They set up in the conference room Claire had been in earlier, the small one with the mismatched chairs and the whiteboard, and started working. Delgado's team fed them documents. Reyes walked them through the footage. Another soldier laid out the system log analysis on the table in printed form because Ferris had specifically asked for hard copies. Claire was not in that room. She was in the ICU because Greer had had another pressure fluctuation at 1:40 a.m., and Avery had paged her and she'd come. And she was standing at his bedside reading numbers that were telling her the same story they'd been telling her for the last 2 hours. Stable, fragile, holding. She adjusted a medication rate by a small increment, documented it, and watched the pressure respond the way she'd expected it to. Avery, who was charting nearby, looked up. Can I ask you something? You already asked me something, Claire said. Different question. Go ahead. How are you not... She stopped, looked for the word. Angrier. Claire looked at the monitor for a moment. The steady electronic patience of it, numbers updating every 3 seconds, the body's ongoing negotiation with itself displayed in data. I'm angry, she said. You don't look it. I know. She made a note in the chart. I learned a long time ago that anger in a clinical setting is mostly a liability. You spend the energy on the problem, not on the feeling about the problem. But they suspended you. They walked you out. And then you came back and saved his life, and they were still going to be what they are, Claire said. Yeah, she capped her pen. The anger's there, I'm just not going to let it run things. Avery was quiet for a moment, then, I reported it, the IV thing. Before you came in this morning, I saw the rate was wrong and I put in a note to flag it for the primary team. Claire looked at her. Nobody responded, Avery said. I thought maybe I'd miscalculated, and then you came in and adjusted it, and I thought, okay, someone caught it, and then you got suspended, and I thought... She pressed her mouth together. I should have pushed harder. What time did you flag it? Claire said. 6:55, right before handoff. Which meant Holt had already changed it, which meant Avery's note had gone into a system that Holt was monitoring, which meant Avery had also been watched and assessed and quietly deprioritized. Her note buried under the automatic assumption that a floor nurse's observation was less significant than whatever the primary team had already decided. Your note is in the record, Claire said. The federal investigators are going to find it. Avery looked at the floor. You didn't do anything wrong, Claire said, and she meant it, and she could tell from the slight shift in Avery's posture that it landed the way it was meant to. Then, at 2:47 a.m., Agent Ferris came out of the conference room and asked for Claire. She went in and sat across from Ferris and the male agent, Torres, she'd learned, and for the next 40 minutes answered questions with the precision she'd applied to everything else tonight. Dates, times, observations, the exact sequence of what she'd noticed and when she'd noticed it, and what she'd done with each piece of information. Ferris wrote in a notebook with a mechanical pencil and didn't look up much. Torres asked clarifying questions that told her he already understood most of what she was describing and was checking specific details rather than building basic comprehension. The pericardiocentesis procedure, Ferris said. Walk me through the decision timeline. She did. Ferris wrote, You made that call without consulting a physician. There wasn't time to consult, she said, and the physicians on site had already demonstrated that their assessment of his condition was incomplete. That's a significant clinical decision for a nurse. Yes, Claire said, it is. Ferris looked up for the first time in several minutes. Where did you develop that skill set? Military service, Claire said. Before I went into nursing. Torres and Ferris exchanged a look. Brief, professional, the look of people who already know the answer to a question they've just asked. We're aware of your service record, Ms. Hart, Torres said. Major Delgado provided the relevant background when he briefed us. She kept her expression neutral, though something shifted slightly inside her at the idea of her service record being passed around a conference room by people she'd met 4 hours ago. She understood why. She didn't particularly love it. Then you know the decision was within my competency, she said. That's not in question, Ferris said, and went back to writing. When it was done, Ferris set down the pencil and looked at her directly for the first time with an expression that was something like forthright. For the record, Ms. Hart, your documentation is the clearest evidence chain we have. Time-stamped, complete, no gaps. Whatever happens in the investigation, that record is solid. I documented it because it was the right thing to do, Claire said. Not because I was expecting an investigation. I know, Ferris said. That's exactly why it's solid. At 3:30 a.m., Garrison Holt was escorted out of the building, not through the back, not through a service entrance, through the main lobby, because the main lobby was the most direct route to the federal vehicles waiting outside, and nobody had made any operational decision about the optics of it. It was simply the shortest path, and Holt walked it with his hands at his sides and his face arranged into something that was trying to be dignity and not quite making it. Claire wasn't in the lobby. She found out about it 20 minutes later when Marcus Webb, who had been somewhere in the building this entire time, she realized she'd lost track of him hours ago, appeared at the ICU entrance looking like he hadn't slept and wouldn't be able to, and said, They just walked Holt out through the front. She looked at him. Like, out, he said. Federal agents. He didn't have a bag or anything. He leaned against the doorframe. Moore left about 20 minutes before him, through the same door. She absorbed this without saying anything. People saw, Marcus said. The night staff, the lobby desk, some family members who were waiting. He shook his head slightly. It's going to be all over the hospital by morning. She thought about that morning. The one that was technically already today, still hours away, the building filling up with day shift nurses and residents and attending physicians who would come in and find the administrative suite sealed and federal evidence tape across the server room and the ICU locked down to essential personnel. Who would hear whatever version of last night's events filtered through the inevitable chain of people who'd seen pieces of it and assembled their own narratives from those pieces? What about the board, she said. Someone called the board chair at 2 a.m. Marcus said. "I overheard Delgado on the radio." He looked at her with the kind of tiredness that's something other than physical. "Claire, what's going to happen now?" She looked at him. This earnest 22-year-old who was still in his clinical scrubs, who had stayed in this building for reasons she hadn't asked about, who was asking the question the way people ask questions when they need the world to make a specific kind of sense. "The investigation will happen," she said, "and everything that's supposed to come out will come out. And you, what happens to you?" She opened her mouth to answer, and her phone buzzed. Delgado. She stepped away from Marcus and picked up. "You need to come to the conference room," he said. His voice had a texture she hadn't heard in it before tonight. Not concern exactly, but something adjacent. "There's something you need to hear in person." "What is it?" "The investigators found another file," he said, "in Holt's office. Physical documents, not digital." A pause. "Claire, it's not just Greer. He's been doing this longer than we thought, and the second name in those files—" The signal cut out. She pulled the phone away from her ear and looked at it. Full bars, full signal, not a dropped call. The call had ended. She looked down the corridor toward the conference room. The light under the door was different than it had been an hour ago. Brighter, more of it. The kind of light that meant more people and more materials spread across a table, and the specific illuminated intensity of a situation that had just gotten significantly larger. She walked toward it. She was 10 feet from the door when it opened from the inside, and Torres stepped out. And the look on his face when he saw her, the particular careful neutrality of a federal agent who had just learned something that changed the shape of an investigation, stopped her mid-step. "Ms. Hart," he said. She waited. "We need to talk about what Dr. Holt's files say about your discharge from the Army," he said. She didn't move for a moment. Torres held the door and watched her with the careful neutrality of someone who had delivered difficult information before, and had learned that the first few seconds after delivery told you a lot about a person. Claire stood in the corridor and felt the particular quality of that sentence land. Not like a shock, more like a weight she hadn't seen coming settling across her shoulders. And she did what she always did with things she hadn't seen coming, which was to let them settle without reacting until she understood the shape of them. "What does it say?" she said. "Come inside," Torres said. She went inside. The conference room had changed in the last hour. Ferris had pushed 2 tables together and covered them with documents, some printed, some in clear evidence sleeves, some still in manila folders with the kind of institutional labeling that meant they'd come from a physical filing system rather than a digital one. A second federal agent Claire hadn't seen before was photographing documents in the corner. Delgado was standing near the whiteboard with his arms crossed, and when she came in he looked at her with an expression that had something in it she didn't entirely recognize from him, something cautious. She looked at the table, found the documents Torres was moving toward, looked at the top page of the file he opened. It was a letter, typed, on Army letterhead, dated 14 months ago. She read the first paragraph and felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. The letter was from Holt, not from his capacity as a physician at Redwood Memorial, from a prior position, a consulting role she hadn't known about, with a medical review board connected to the Army's Office of the Surgeon General. The letter was addressed to that board. It was, in precise and carefully chosen language, a recommendation against the reinstatement of a combat medic's field certification, citing concerns about psychological stability, decision-making under pressure, and what it called a pattern of unilateral action inconsistent with integrated team protocols. The medic named in the letter was her. She read it twice. The second time slowly. "He was on the review board," she said. "A civilian consultant," Torres said. "The board was evaluating a reinstatement petition, your request to have your field medical certification restored for Reserve Medical Corps eligibility, filed about 16 months ago." She remembered the petition. She'd filed it quietly through the proper channels, not expecting much. She hadn't planned to return to active service, but the Reserve Corps option had seemed worth keeping open. The petition had been denied 8 months ago with a form letter that cited procedural insufficiency and gave no further detail. "He killed it," she said. "His letter was the only negative assessment in the file," Ferris said from across the table. Every other evaluation, from your former commanding officer, from 2 Army physicians who served alongside you, from the board's own initial review, was positive. His letter was submitted 6 weeks after the others and flagged as a late addendum. And the board weighted it. The board gave it significant weight, yes. Civilian medical consultant with hospital credentials, specific clinical concerns filed at a point in the review where there wasn't a standard opportunity for you to respond. Ferris set down her pencil. You weren't notified that a negative assessment had been submitted. She looked at the letter again. At the phrasing, unilateral action, psychological stability, the kind of language that was clinical enough to sound objective and vague enough to be almost impossible to specifically refute. The kind of language someone wrote when they wanted to damage something without leaving fingerprints. Why? She said. To the room, mostly. To whoever had the answer. Delgado spoke. That's what we're still working out, but here's what we have so far. He moved to the table and touched a second document. Another folder. This one, thicker. Holt's consulting role with the review board wasn't his only military-adjacent activity. He had a private consulting arrangement with a medical equipment procurement firm, a company that contracts with the Army for field medical supply systems. She looked at him. The firm had a competing interest, he said, in a specific procurement contract, a contract that was partially influenced by field assessments from special operations medical personnel. The kind of assessments that combat medics with active field certifications contribute to. He paused. Medics with your specific background and mission history. She heard what he wasn't saying. He didn't know me, she said. He couldn't have targeted me specifically. No, but the review board was processing 4 reinstatement petitions at the same time. All 4 were combat medics with relevant field experience. His letter killed 3 of them. He looked at her steadily. The 4th was already out of the country. The room was quiet, except for the soft shutter sound of the agent photographing documents in the corner. She had spent 8 months assuming her petition had failed because the Army didn't want the complication. She had filed the form letter in a drawer and moved on, the way she moved on from most things, because sitting with the unfairness of institutional decisions was something she'd learned early didn't change them. She had not spent those 8 months imagining that a man she'd never met had written a letter designed to end her certification, not because of anything she'd done, not because of any real concern about her competency, but because her field assessments, if reinstated, would have been inconvenient for a contract he had a financial interest in. She thought about the IV line she'd found running wrong at 8:30 a.m. She thought about the notification it had sent to his phone. She thought about how fast he'd moved. He'd recognized her name, not from the floor, from the review board file. He'd known exactly who she was when he suspended her. He knew, she said, when he had me pulled from the floor. He'd seen my name in that file and he recognized it. That's our assessment, Torres said, which means the suspension wasn't just about protecting the Greer case. It was about removing someone who, if she stayed involved, and the situation escalated, might eventually create a context where his consulting role and the review board letter came to light. He was cleaning up, she said. Yes. She stood with that for a moment. Then she put the letter down on the table and stepped back from it, because she didn't want to keep looking at it. What happens to it now? She said. The petition. That's outside our jurisdiction, Torres said. But the letter will be entered into evidence and its context will be part of the record. What the Army does with that... He stopped. I know, she said. Not your call. What? At 4:15 a.m., she walked to the end of the corridor and stood at the window that looked out over the hospital's side parking lot, which was mostly empty at this hour except for a scatter of staff vehicles and the 2 federal SUVs that had been there since midnight. The sky outside was still dark, but had the specific quality of dark that meant it wasn't going to stay that way much longer. She was tired. Not the dangerous kind of tired, not the kind that compromised function, but the ordinary accumulation of a very long day that had turned into a very long night and was still going. Her phone had 17 missed messages, 3 from numbers she didn't recognize, which meant hospital staff who'd gotten her personal number from somewhere. 4 from a local news station that she had no idea how they'd already gotten this far. 2 from her sister in Colorado who had somehow heard something, which was a conversation for a different time zone and a different hour. The rest from Marcus, in ascending order of urgency and decreasing order of complete sentences. She texted Marcus, "I'm okay. Go home." His response came in 30 seconds. "I'm in the break room on 4. I can't leave." She almost typed back something dismissive and then didn't because he'd stayed in the building all night without being asked to, which was either foolish or loyal, and she wasn't sure the distinction mattered. "Break room is fine," she wrote. "Don't come to the ICU." She put the phone in her pocket. Delgado appeared at her elbow with the quiet approach of someone trained to move without announcing themselves. He stood beside her at the window for a moment without saying anything, which she appreciated. "The board chair is coming in at 6, he said eventually. "Which board?" "Hospital board. The chair and 2 members. Ferris requested the meeting." He paused. "The investigators want to lay out the evidence structure before the regular business day starts, and this gets out through other channels." "It's already out through other channels," she said. "I know, but formally." He looked at the parking lot. "There are going to be decisions made today about the hospital's immediate operating status, about temporary leadership, about the nursing staff and their contracts, while the administrative structure is under investigation." A beat. "About your employment status." "I was suspended." "You were suspended by an administrator who was arrested 6 hours ago for obstruction of federal evidence," he said. "That suspension has the legal durability of wet paper." She almost smiled, didn't quite get there. "Delgado," she said. "The other 2 medics, the other petitions he killed. We're flagging them," he said. "It'll be part of the referral to the Army IG's office." He looked at her. "It's not nothing, Claire. What we found in there, it's a complete picture. It takes time, but it's not nothing." She nodded, looked back out the window. "I know," she said. Vid. At 5:30 a.m., Avery found her in the ICU and told her Greer was asking to see her. She hadn't expected that. She'd had a version of the rest of this night mapped out in her head, the investigators, the board, the administrative unraveling, and Greer asking to speak to her wasn't in it. She went in. He was awake, which was itself something. He'd been unconscious or heavily sedated for every moment she'd been in this room before now. He was 62, she knew from the records, though he looked older at this hour in this light. The particular diminishment that hospitals impose on people regardless of who they are outside them. He had gray hair and a square face and the kind of eyes that suggested he paid attention to things and remembered them. He looked at her when she came in and said, "You're Hart." "Yes." "Delgado told me." His voice was rough. Intubation, dehydration, the general insult of the night. "He said you came back." "I did." "After they threw you out." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the ceiling, and she could see him doing the calculation that conscious patients did when they woke up in ICUs, assembling the night from the fragments available, trying to understand the distance between where they'd been and where they were. "How bad was it?" he said. "Bad enough," she said. "You're stable now. The cardiothoracic team is doing a planned drainage this morning. You'll need a follow-up surgical consult on some scar tissue from a prior injury, but nothing acute." "I know about the scar tissue," he said, with a faint dry edge that told her he'd been managing that information for some time and had made decisions about it she probably wouldn't have made. "I know you know," she said. He looked at her. "I didn't want the full history in a civilian system." "I understand the reasoning. It almost killed me." "Yes," she said. "It did." He took that without deflecting it, which she respected. "I'm sorry for what happened to you today. Delgado told me about the suspension. It's being addressed. It shouldn't have happened." "No," she said. "It shouldn't." He looked at her for a moment longer with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Something that had gratitude in it and something else, some additional weight that she didn't have enough context to identify. "You'd think I'd have something better to say. You had a pericardial tamponade," she said. "Your word count is reasonable." He almost laughed. It came out as a rough exhale, but it was in the right direction. She left him to rest. The hospital board chair arrived at 6:10 a.m., 20 minutes before the administrative day formally began. Her name was Patricia Waugh, late 60s, silver-haired, the kind of person who wore authority the way other people wore clothing, naturally and without apparent effort. She came with two other board members and a personal attorney who stayed in the corridor while Waugh went into the conference room with Ferris and Torres and Delgado and the hospital's overnight counsel, who looked like he hadn't slept in 36 hours and was running entirely on the legal instinct that makes some people good under pressure and breaks other people entirely. Claire was not in that meeting. She was told she would be called in. She sat in the family waiting area again, same chair as earlier, no vending machine coffee this time, because the machine had run out of everything except a lemon drink that she wasn't willing to try at 6 a.m. She had her phone in her hand and was not looking at it. Marcus came and sat across from her at 6:20. He'd changed his scrub top at some point, which meant he'd gone to his locker, which meant he really had been in this building all night. "You look terrible," she said. "You look worse," he said, which was probably true. They sat in the particular companionable silence of people who've been through something together and don't need to talk about it continuously to acknowledge that it happened. "What are they deciding in there, Botosi?" he said eventually. "Interim leadership, operating status, whether to bring in external management while the administration is under investigation. Can they keep running without Holt and Moore?" "The clinical staff runs the hospital," she said. "Administration provides structure. You can run with bad structure for a while. You can't run without clinical staff." "That's actually reassuring," he said. "Don't get too reassured. Bad structure costs people." He looked at his hands. "What about you? What do you want to happen?" She thought about it. Not the political answer, not the institutional answer. What she actually wanted, right now, at 6:25 in the morning after a night like this one. "I want the investigation to find everything there is to find," she said. "I want the people who altered those records to face what that means legally. And I want—" She stopped. "I want the other petitions looked at. The other medics Holt shut down. That matters more to me than what happens to my employment status here." Marcus looked at her like she'd said something surprising. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Just, most people would have led with themselves." "Most people weren't trained not to," she said, and stood up because someone was coming down the corridor toward her, and she recognized the walk as Ferris before she recognized the face. Ferris took her into the conference room at 6:38 a.m., and Claire sat across from Patricia Waugh, and they looked at each other for a moment the way people look at each other when there's a lot of context, and neither of them has been fully briefed on the other's version of it. "Ms. Hart," Waugh said, "I've spent the last 20 minutes reviewing the evidence summary Agent Ferris has prepared. I want to be direct with you because I think directness is the only appropriate mode at this point." She folded her hands. "What was done to you yesterday was wrong. The suspension was retaliatory. The documentation used to support it was fabricated, and the people responsible for both of those things are no longer in a position to make decisions about this hospital." She paused. "I'm voiding the suspension effective now. Your personnel file will be corrected. If you choose to return to this facility in any capacity, that will be your decision, not anyone else's." Claire listened. "I also want to say," Waugh continued, "that the board is aware of what happened in the ICU last night. We've spoken with Dr. Vance from Cardiothoracic, with Agent Ferris, and with Major Delgado. What you did, coming back after how you'd been treated, performing a procedure that every other physician on site had missed the need for, that's not something I can adequately address in a conference room at 6 in the morning." She stopped, and for a moment the board chair exterior thinned slightly, just slightly, into something that was less institutional. "I'm going to ask you something that you have no obligation to answer. When they suspended you and you left, why did you come back when Delgado called?" Claire thought about the parking lot, about sitting in her car, about the particular calculation that had happened in the 3 minutes between hearing Delgado's voice and turning the car around. "Because the patient needed someone who knew what they were looking at," she said. "Everything else was secondary." Waugh held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, the kind of nod that's a complete sentence. Thought. At 8 a.m., the day shift arrived, and the building changed. It changed the way buildings change when the population shifts. The noise level, the movement patterns, The particular frequency of a space that's been quiet for hours, suddenly filling with people who don't know what the people already there know. Day shift nurses came in and found the ICU under a modified access protocol. Residents came in and found the attending schedule had a gap where Holt's name had been. People gathered in hallways, compared information, assembled narratives from fragments. By 8:30 a.m., the story was moving through the hospital in at least 4 different versions, none of them entirely accurate, all of them containing enough truth to be unsettling. Claire heard pieces of it as she moved through the corridor. Holt arrested, federal agents, a government patient, something about the record system, something about a nurse. A nurse. She walked through it steadily, the way she walked through most things, and didn't stop to correct versions that were wrong, and didn't stop to confirm versions that were right, because that wasn't her job, and she was still technically on a shift she'd never formally ended. At 8:45, something happened that she hadn't expected. She was at the 4th floor nursing station, updating her documentation on Greer's overnight care, completing the record that was already the most complete single-patient documentation she'd produced in 3 years, when she heard the elevator open and looked up and saw a man in Army service uniform walk out, accompanied by 2 aides and Delgado, who changed into a clean uniform at some point in the last few hours. The man was a general. She could read rank at distance without thinking about it, the way you read things that were once important enough to be automatic. Brigadier General Morrow. She'd met him once, 4 years ago, at a debrief after an operation that had gone badly in several ways, and well in one, the one that mattered. He'd shaken her hand in a hallway and said something she hadn't fully processed at the time because she'd been exhausted and medicated for a hand injury she hadn't reported fully. He was here now, in this hospital, in this corridor. He saw her at the nursing station and walked directly to her, which meant the people around her, the charge nurse, 2 floor nurses, Marcus, who'd apparently still not gone home, all experienced the particular social phenomenon of watching a general walk toward a suspended floor nurse with intent. "Sergeant Hart," Morrow said. "Sir," she said, automatically, before she'd consciously decided to. "At ease," he said, which was a slightly absurd thing to say in a hospital corridor, and she could tell from the fractional adjustment in his expression that he knew it. "I've been briefed on last night." He paused. "And on the review board situation." She waited. "The letter from Holt is being examined by the IG's office as of 2 hours ago," he said, "along with the 3 other petitions it affected. The board's decision on your certification is under formal review, which means it's suspended pending the outcome of that review." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to hear that directly from me, and not from a form letter." "I appreciate that," she said. "What you did last night, the decision you made in that ICU, was consistent with every field assessment your commanding officers ever wrote about you." He said it plainly, without ceremony. "I don't say that for effect. I say it because the board letter said otherwise, and I want the record corrected in person before the paperwork catches up." She looked at him. This man who had come in person at 8:45 in the morning to stand in a hospital corridor and say out loud what a form letter couldn't adequately say. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "There are going to be interviews, documentation requests, a formal IG process. It's not going to be fast." "I know how the process works," she said. "I know you do." Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, more a specific acknowledgement, one professional to another. "That's actually why I came in person." He moved on toward the ICU to see Greer, and the 2 aides followed, and Delgado passed her with a look that wasn't quite "I told you so," and wasn't quite anything else she could name either. She turned back to her documentation. The charge nurse beside her said nothing for about 15 seconds. Then, "Sergeant?" "It was a long time ago," Claire said, and kept typing. At 10:30 a.m., the second wave hit. She was in Greer's room when Avery came to the door with an expression that meant something had happened, and it wasn't something administrative. "There's a woman downstairs," Avery said, "in the lobby. She's been there since 9. She says she's a journalist and she has documents and she's asking for you by name." Claire looked up. "She told the front desk she has a copy of Holt's consulting agreement," Avery said. The one with the procurement firm. How does she have that? She says it was sent to her anonymously, 6 months ago. Avery paused. She says she's been sitting on it because she couldn't verify it, and then last night happened and she wants to talk to you. A journalist with a 6-month-old document she'd been unable to verify, which meant the document itself wasn't new. The story wasn't new. Someone had known about Holt's arrangement months ago and had tried to get it out through the press and hit the same wall of unverifiability that the investigation had needed a federal evidence chain to break through. Who sent it to her? Claire said. She says she doesn't know. Anonymous email, no metadata. She thought about the 3 other medics whose petitions Holt's letter had killed. She thought about whoever among them had known enough about the consulting arrangement to have the document and had tried 6 months ago to do something with that knowledge, and had been unsuccessful, and had been quiet since. She thought about how long some people carry things before anyone else knows they've been carrying them. Tell her I'll come down in 30 minutes, she said. Are you sure that's, Avery started. Tell her 30 minutes. She went back to the chart. Greer's numbers were holding. The cardiothoracic team was prepping for the drainage procedure at noon. Everything that needed to be done in this room was progressing the way it was supposed to progress. She finished the documentation, signed it, and closed the chart. Then she picked up her phone and called Ferris. There's a journalist in the lobby, she said. She has Holt's consulting agreement. She's had it for 6 months. A brief pause on Ferris's end. Don't talk to her before I do. I'm not planning to. I'm calling you first. Good. Another pause. Hart. This document, if it's authentic, and she's had it 6 months, that means someone tried to surface this information and couldn't. I know, Claire said, which means the people who knew about Holt's arrangement, or at least one of them, have been trying to stop him for a while. Yes. We need to know who sent it to her. I know, she said again. Which is why I called you. She hung up and walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. The doors opened. She stepped in. As they closed, she saw Marcus at the nursing station, watching her with that particular expression of his, the one that was still learning what to do with what it saw. And she thought about what he'd said earlier, about most people leading with themselves, and she thought about how much of last night had been built on people leading with exactly that, with their own position and their own exposure and their own version of events, the constant recalculation of self-interest that had left a government official's IV running wrong for a whole morning while everyone looked at the documentation that could protect them. The elevator descended. In the lobby below, a woman with a 6-month-old document sat waiting in a chair, and somewhere in the building above her, a general was reviewing a case file, and 2 federal agents were photographing evidence, and a man who had spent years building the specific architecture of his own protection was sitting in a federal holding facility watching it come apart at the exact joints he'd thought were solid. The elevator opened. Claire walked out into the lobby. And the journalist, mid-40s, dark coat, a folder on her lap that she was holding with both hands, the way people hold things they've been carrying too long, looked up, and something in her face changed. The particular expression of someone who has been waiting a very long time for the right person to walk through a door. She stood up, opened the folder, pulled out a document that had a name on the cover page and handed it across. Claire looked at the name. It wasn't Holt's, it was Moore's, and below it, a third name she hadn't seen anywhere in the evidence chain, a name attached to a medical board position that had nothing to do with Redwood Memorial and everything to do with a regulatory body that sat above it. Someone else had been involved from the beginning, someone who was still, as of this moment, completely untouched. The name on the document was Dr. Raymond Kassler. Claire read it twice, the way she'd read Holt's letter, once fast, once slow. And both times the name stayed the same and the position listed beneath it stayed the same. Regional Director, State Medical Oversight Board, appointed 18 months ago. The kind of regulatory role that sat above individual hospitals and could, if occupied by the right person for the wrong reasons, provide a ceiling of protection that made everything below it harder to prosecute. She looked up at the journalist. Where did this come from? The same anonymous source as the consulting agreement, the woman said. Her name was Dana Price, she'd said when she stood up. and she had the controlled energy of someone who had been sitting on something volatile for a long time and was choosing each word carefully now that the situation had finally moved. Same email address, which traced to a public library terminal in Raleigh, sent 6 months ago. Both documents at once? Yes, the consulting agreement and this. She gestured at the folder. The agreement I understood. It was financial. It was verifiable in theory if I could get a source to confirm it. This one, she paused. Kessler's position makes him harder to touch. I couldn't find anyone willing to go on record, and without that, publishing something that directly names a sitting regulatory official is career-ending if you're wrong, Claire said. Yes. Dana looked at her steadily. But I'm not wrong. I've known that for 6 months. I just couldn't prove it alone. Claire looked at the document again. The consulting agreement between Moore and Kasler's private medical advisory firm, predating both Moore's position at Redwood Memorial and Kasler's appointment to the oversight board. A financial relationship that had existed before either of them had the institutional power that made the relationship dangerous. They'd come up together, built their positions together, and when Holt's arrangement with the procurement firm had created an opportunity, Kasler's position on the oversight board had been the roof over the whole structure. The reason a complaint against Redwood Memorial's administration would have been reviewed by someone with a financial reason to bury it. She called Ferris. Ferris came down in 4 minutes, which meant she'd either been already moving or she moved very fast when the situation required it. She looked at the document, looked at Dana Price, and said, I need to make a call. Don't go anywhere. She stepped away with her phone, and Claire stood in the lobby with the journalist and the document and the particular quality of a situation that had just gotten larger in a direction nobody had fully anticipated. Did you know about Kasler before last night? Dana said. No, Claire said, but you knew something was off above the hospital level. I knew the shape of it, not the name, Dana nodded slowly. The person who sent this to me. I think they were one of the medics, the petition medics. She kept her voice low. I think they found out about the consulting arrangement and tried to surface it and hit the oversight board and realized the oversight board was the problem and they didn't know what to do with that. Claire thought about that person, whoever they were, whichever of the 3 other names from those review board files, sitting with a document that proved the corruption and having nowhere to take it that wasn't already compromised, sending it to a journalist as the only remaining option, and then waiting for 6 months while nothing visibly happened. Some people carry things a long time before anyone else knows. We're going to need to find them, Claire said, not to Dana, mostly to herself. They're a witness. I know, Dana said. I've been trying. What happened next happened in the way that large institutional collapses happen. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in a series of procedural steps that each seemed small and became enormous in aggregate. Ferris made her call. The call was to a supervisor in the DOJ's regional office who had been briefed on the Redwood Memorial situation and who, upon hearing Kasler's name and the nature of the document, initiated a secondary evidence review that pulled in the state attorney general's office by 11:30 a.m. The oversight board's records were subpoenaed before noon. Kasler's private advisory firm's financial records followed within 2 hours, processed through an emergency judicial order that Ferris's office had apparently used before and knew how to move quickly. Kasler himself was at his office in the state capitol, 50 miles from Ashford City, when the investigators arrived at 1:15 p.m. He was not arrested immediately. The evidence wasn't yet at that threshold, but his access to the oversight board's systems was suspended pending review, and the 2 investigators who arrived were polite and thorough and took 4 boxes of documents and his work laptop and left him with a receipt and a contact number for the process going forward. Claire found out about it from Delgado at 1:40 p.m., between Greer's drainage procedure and a documentation review that Ferris's team had requested from the nursing records. She was standing in the 4th-floor corridor with a coffee that was actually from a real coffee maker this time, from the break room that had been returned to functional use, and she listened to Delgado give her the update and felt something settle in her that had been held in a specific kind of tension since the moment in the lobby when she'd read that 3rd name and understood the system had been bigger than any of them had mapped. He's not arrested, she said. Not yet. The financial records will get there. His firm's billing to Moore goes back 4 years, and there are payment structures in it that the AG's office is already describing as structurally similar to cases they've successfully prosecuted. He paused. It'll move slower than Holt and Moore. He has better lawyers and more distance from the clinical decisions. But the document trail is clean. How long? Months, he said. Not years. She nodded. She'd known it wouldn't be fast. Fast was for movies, for stories where the ending was the same night as the crisis. Real accountability moved through processes and filings and evidentiary chains and hearings, and it took the time it took, and the people who'd been harmed by the original thing had to live in the interval. The other petitions, she said. Any movement? The IG's office contacted all 3 medics this morning. 2 of them responded within the hour. He looked at her. The third one, we think they're the anonymous source. She looked at him. The email trace from the library terminal led to a city near Fort Bragg, he said. One of the 3 medics is stationed at a reserve unit 20 minutes from there. The investigators are talking to them this afternoon. She thought about that person, someone who'd known, who'd tried, who'd sent the document to a journalist and then sat in silence for 6 months watching nothing happen. Getting a call this morning from a federal investigator saying, we found it, we have it, you're not carrying this alone anymore. She didn't say anything for a moment. Okay, she said. Good. The cardiothoracic drainage on Greer completed at 2:20 p.m. Dr. Vance came out of the procedure room with the focused satisfaction of a surgeon whose plan had gone according to plan. Not perfectly, he told Claire. There had been a point where the residual adhesion from the old scar tissue had complicated the approach, and they'd had to adjust, but the fluid was out and the cardiac function was already showing improvement on the monitor. He's going to need a proper surgical consultation on that scar tissue, Vance said. Not here. Somewhere with the right imaging capability and a thoracic team that knows field trauma repair. Walter Reed, she said. That would be my recommendation, yes. I'll pass it to Delgado. Vance looked at her for a moment. He had, she'd noticed, the habit of looking at people slightly longer than conversational norms required. Not aggressively, more like someone who processed things visually and hadn't entirely learned to hide it. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. The adhesion point I ran into in there, the pattern of the original repair, it's not standard surgical technique. He paused. It's good work. Actually very good work for the conditions it was done in, but it's not textbook. No, she said. It wouldn't be. Who did it? Someone who had what they had and used it correctly, she said. He looked at her for that extra second. Were you there? She picked up the procedure notes he'd handed her. Greer's going to want a real meal when he wakes up. He's been NPO since yesterday morning. Clear fluids first, then we reassess. Vance, who was smart enough to read a closed door, didn't push. Noted, he said, and moved on. At 4 p.m., the hospital board convened an emergency session in the second-floor conference room, and at 4:45 p.m., Patricia Waugh came out and found Claire and asked her to come in. The room had 8 people in it, the full board, minus one member who'd been unreachable all day. They looked like people who had spent the day reading documents they hadn't wanted to read and had arrived at a collective emotional state somewhere between institutional shame and the particular determination that comes from understanding that inaction is also a choice. Waugh spoke first. The board has reviewed the evidence summary provided by federal investigators, the employment records involved, and the clinical documentation from last night. We've also reviewed Ms. Hart's personnel file in its entirety, including the formal warning issued yesterday, which has been removed. She looked at Claire directly. On behalf of this board, I want to issue a formal apology. The institutional failures that occurred here, the retaliatory suspension, the pattern of dismissal you experienced from our medical leadership, the mechanisms that allowed those behaviors to go unchecked, those are failures the board owns. Not just Holt, not just Moore. The board. Claire listened. She'd expected something formal. This was more than that. Waugh meant it, which was different. We're retaining external management for a transition period, Waugh continued. Clinical operations will continue under interim physician leadership effective immediately. The nursing staff and clinical personnel are not under any employment review, so their positions are secure. She paused. We would like to offer you a return to this facility in whatever capacity you choose, if you choose to return at all. I appreciate that, Claire said. Is there anything you want to say to this board directly? Waugh asked. She thought about it, about what she could say, what was worth saying, what would actually mean something in a room like this versus what would just sound like the thing you say. The nurse who flagged the IV before I came in that morning, she said. Avery. She submitted a note to the primary team at 6:55 a.m. It was ignored. She's been here 2 years and she's good, better than the environment she's working in. Whatever you build after this, make sure it's the kind of place that listens when someone like her says something. She looked around the table. Because the problem wasn't just Holt. The problem was a culture where a floor nurse's observation was automatically less credible than a physician's silence. That's what you actually need to fix. The room was quiet. Waugh nodded. Not the conclusive nod this time. The kind that means I heard that, and I'm going to sit with it. Thank you, she said. Holt's arraignment was at 9 a.m. the following morning, and Claire wasn't there. She was at the VA clinic on the east side of Ashford City, finishing a volunteer shift she'd committed to 3 weeks ago and hadn't canceled because canceling it would have meant the 6 veterans scheduled for that morning would have had to reschedule, and the rescheduling waitlist was 11 weeks long. She cleaned a wound on a 68-year-old man who didn't want to talk about how he'd gotten it, and she didn't ask. She sat with a 44-year-old woman who was having a hard week for reasons that didn't need to be explained and just needed someone to be present for 20 minutes. She did the work that needed to be done because it needed to be done. She found out about the arraignment from Marcus, who texted her at 10:30. Both of them. More, too. Charges are serious. It's on the news. She read the text, finished her documentation, and put the phone back in her pocket. Moore had been charged with obstruction of federal evidence and conspiracy to conceal medical malpractice. Holt faced those charges and 2 additional counts: intentional alteration of a patient medical record and criminal endangerment of a federal official. The specific charge language mattered, Ferris had explained to her the previous evening. Criminal endangerment required proving intent, and the camera footage combined with the login timestamp gave prosecutors exactly that. Holt had walked into that room at 6:31 a.m. and changed the IV rate and known what he was doing and why. And that was now on record in a way that his attorneys were going to spend a long time trying to argue around. Kessler's situation resolved more slowly, the way Delgado had said it would. The financial records took 3 weeks to fully process. The AG's office filed charges in the 5th week: 2 counts of corruption in office, 1 count of conspiracy. His resignation from the oversight board came on the day the charges were filed, which was 12 minutes after the filing became public record, which suggested his attorney had been watching for exactly that moment and had the resignation letter already prepared. The 3 review board petitions, the other medics whose certifications Holt's letter had blocked, were formally reopened by the Army IG's office in the 3rd week. The anonymous source turned out to be a woman named Staff Sergeant Diane Vela, stationed in Fayetteville, who had found out about Holt's consulting arrangement through a financial disclosure she'd accessed during a separate grievance process, and had spent 4 months trying to figure out what to do with it before sending the documents to Dana Price. She gave a recorded statement to the IG's office and was, by all accounts, precise and thorough and had documented everything. Claire talked to her once, by phone, 2 weeks after everything. I didn't think anyone was going to find it, Vela said. Not bitter, just factual. I didn't know any of it existed until someone handed me the document in a lobby, Claire said. That's what gets me, Vela said. I spent all that time trying to find the right channel, and there wasn't one. And then one night in a hospital, everything just broke open. It wasn't one night, Claire said. You sent the document. Donna held it. The federal team built the evidence chain. It was a lot of people doing things that didn't look connected until they were. A pause. I guess that's true. It's also true that you did something hard with no guarantee it was going to work, Claire said. That matters even when it feels like it didn't. Vela was quiet for a moment. Then, are you getting your certification back? The review's still open, Claire said. But you think so? She thought about Major Delgado in a hospital corridor, about General Morrow saying consistent with every field assessment, about a form letter she'd filed in a drawer, and the 8 months she'd spent not thinking about it too much. Yeah, she said. I think so. Pot. The formal certification reinstatement came 6 weeks after the events at Redwood Memorial, in a letter that used the specific administrative language of a bureaucratic process concluding, dry, procedural, almost entirely without effect. Holt's letter was formally struck from the record. The board's original positive assessments were reinstated as the determinative documentation. Her field medical certification for reserve course eligibility was restored effective immediately. She read the letter standing at her kitchen counter at 7 a.m., still in the clothes she'd slept in, with a coffee that was better than anything from the hospital vending machine, which was not a high bar. She stood there for a while. She'd spent 8 months telling herself the certification didn't matter that much, that she'd made her choice, that civilian nursing was where she was, that the drawer she'd put the form letter in was a reasonable place for it to stay. And some of that had been true. She had made her choice, and she had meant it, and the work she did as a floor nurse was real and necessary and not a consolation. But she also knew, standing in her kitchen with the reinstatement letter, that the drawer had always felt slightly wrong, that the thing taken from her, not just the certification, but the particular kind of contribution only she could make, the knowledge accumulated across years of doing impossible things in impossible conditions, had been taken by someone who'd had no real claim on it, for reasons that had nothing to do with her competency. It was back now. She put the letter on the counter and drank her coffee. Well, she returned to clinical work 2 weeks later, not at Redwood Memorial. Stonehaven Medical Center was in Westbridge, 40 miles from Ashford City, a teaching hospital affiliated with the Reserve Medical Corps training program that Delgado had mentioned in passing 3 weeks earlier, almost as an aside, the way people mention things they've already partially arranged and want to see how you respond. The role was advanced trauma instruction for nursing and medical staff, with a secondary function supporting the Reserve Corps' civilian integration program, teaching field techniques to medical personnel who would deploy as reserve medical support and needed to understand trauma management in conditions that weren't hospital corridors with full supply rooms and reliable power. It was, exactly, the thing she was actually built for. Not despite the military years or despite the nursing years, but because of both. Because she was one of the people who could hold both things at once and translate between them, and those people were not common. She started on a Tuesday. The session had 12 participants, a mix of nurses, a physician's assistant, 2 residents rotating through the trauma program. She walked in with a supply kit and a case study and no particular speech prepared because she'd never been someone who delivered speeches. She put the kit on the table and looked at the room. I'm going to assume you know the textbook version of everything we're going to cover, she said. So we're not going to do the textbook version. We're going to do the version where the equipment you need isn't available and the patient can't wait, and you have to figure out what you actually know versus what you've been told to do. She looked around the room. Those are different things. We're here to find out which is which. Someone in the back said, How do we know the difference? You make a decision under pressure and you find out, she said. That's the only way. She opened the kit. The session ran 3 hours. Afterward, one of the residents, a young man who'd been skeptical for the first 40 minutes and then very engaged for the remaining 2 hours and 20, stopped her on the way out. Where did you learn that needle approach? He said. The modified pericardiocentesis angle. Forward operating environment, she said. No imaging. You adapt. Can you teach it? I just did, she said. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd seen on a number of faces over the past 6 weeks. The recalibration one. The adjustment that happened when someone's prior understanding of what a person was turned out to be significantly smaller than the actual thing. She'd stopped finding it satisfying and started finding it simply true. She went back to Redwood Memorial once. Not for a shift. Not officially. She went back on a Wednesday afternoon, 3 months after everything, because Avery had texted her that the new interim department head wanted to consult on a protocol revision and had specifically requested her input, and she had said yes because the protocol in question was about nursing escalation procedures. The specific process by which a floor nurse could formally escalate a clinical concern over a physician's objection. and if she could make that process better, it was worth an afternoon. She walked in through the main entrance. The lobby was different, not redesigned, just different in the way spaces are different when the people running them change. There was a new directory board. The front desk had been reconfigured. Small things. She took the elevator to 4. The floor looked the same. The nursing station, the corridor, the patient rooms with their steady mechanical rhythms. Some of the faces were familiar. The respiratory tech who'd worked with her that night, who nodded when he saw her without stopping. A float nurse she'd worked with occasionally, who did a small double take. Avery was at the nursing station. She looked up and smiled, not a performance, just a real uncomplicated expression that meant she was glad Claire was there. "Thanks for coming," she said. "I said I would." They walked to the conference room, the same small one with the mismatched chairs, though someone had replaced the whiteboard with a new one and the half-erased differential was gone. The interim department head, a physician named Dr. Farwell, who'd come in from the external management firm, had the protocol draft laid out on the table and got to the point quickly, which Claire appreciated. The conversation ran 90 minutes. She made 3 specific recommendations, one about documentation thresholds, one about the escalation chain's bypass provision, one about the time frame requirement that was currently so long it rendered the whole process theoretical in acute situations. Farwell listened and asked good questions and wrote things down. When it was done, Claire stood up and picked up her bag. "One more thing," Farwell said. "The board asked me to pass something along." He reached into a folder and produced an envelope sealed with the hospital board's letterhead on the front. From WA. She opened it. It was a formal letter, 1 page. The language was institutional, but the content was specific. A statement for the record, signed by the full board, documenting the retaliatory suspension, the false basis for the formal warning, and the board's formal finding that Claire Hart had acted with full clinical and professional integrity throughout her tenure at Redwood Memorial. The letter specified that this document was to be entered permanently into her professional record and transmitted to any institution that had received the prior adverse documentation. At the bottom, below the signatures, Waugh had written by hand, "You told us what to fix. We're fixing it." Claire stood in the conference room with the letter for a moment. Then she folded it carefully, put it in her bag, and thanked Farwell for his time. She walked back through the corridor, past the nursing station, past the elevator she'd taken up and down too many times to count on a night that had changed more things than she'd known it would. Avery was at the desk and looked up as she passed. "You coming back?" Avery said. Avery, not hoping, not pressuring, just asking, the way people ask when they want to know the actual answer. "I've got something else," Claire said, "but I'll consult." She paused. "You should think about the trauma program at Stonehaven. They're looking for experienced nurses." Avery looked at her. "Are you serious? You gave me clean numbers and sequence in a crisis." "Yes, I'm serious." She walked to the elevator and pressed the button and the doors opened, and she stepped in. As they closed, she caught one last look at the corridor. The ordinary ongoing work of it, the nurses charting and moving and doing the 1,000 quiet things that kept people alive, the work that looked unremarkable from the outside and was anything but. And she thought about what she'd believed 3 months ago when she'd walked out of this building with a deactivated ID badge and sat in her car in the parking lot in the dark. She'd thought she was moving on. She'd been moving toward. There's something that doesn't get said enough about the people who get dismissed. Not the dramatic cases. Not the ones that make news, but the ordinary accumulated dismissals that happen in institutions every day, in corridors and meeting rooms and personnel files and the small transactions of who gets listened to and who doesn't. Those dismissals cost something, not just to the person dismissed, but to everyone downstream of the decision, the patients, the students, the colleagues who would have learned something, the situations that would have gone differently if the right person had been in the room and allowed to speak. Claire Hart was not a perfect person. She was impatient with slowness that cost people. She was not good at accepting that bureaucratic timelines were fixed when she could see someone being harmed by the delay. She sometimes made decisions that made the people around her uncomfortable because she'd done the calculation faster than they had and moved before they were ready. Those things were also true. But she had spent years building a specific kind of knowledge, the the kind that only comes from being in situations where the wrong decision has immediate and irreversible consequences. And she had brought that knowledge into a civilian setting where it was technically unnecessary and quietly indispensable and largely invisible, the way a lot of the most important things are invisible until they're suddenly the only thing that matters. She had not asked to be recognized. She had not performed competence for an audience. She had fixed an IV line, documented it, and gone back to work. And that had been enough to threaten someone, which told you everything about what kind of threat the truth can be when an institution has decided it prefers a comfortable version of events. They suspended her. She came back. Not because she needed them to know who she was, because there was a man upstairs who needed someone who knew what they were looking at, and she was that person, and the rest of it, the badge, the paperwork, the formal warning in the file, was secondary to the thing that actually needed doing. That's the part that's hardest to explain to people who haven't been there. It's not that the injustice didn't matter. It's that the work mattered more in the moment than the injustice. And that's not resignation. It's not passivity. It's the specific discipline of knowing what you're actually there for and refusing to let other people's failures determine whether you show up for it. She never needed their permission to be who she was. The army already knew. The patients already knew. And eventually, whether it took a night or a year or a federal investigation, the truth had a way of becoming very difficult to argue with. That's the thing about people who do the work quietly and do it well. You can dismiss them. You can suspend them. You can walk them out through the lobby with their badge deactivated, but you cannot take back what they know, and you cannot take back what they've already done.